And then while that is occurring, this group is also going to be responsible for monitoring those outcomes. And that's sort of what I was speaking of, that we want to think about that up front so that we set up the process so that we are ingesting that information, or you guys are ingesting that information as it's occurring, so that, because some of it isn't just available at the very end, of course, depending on how we identify what those KPIs are. And then ideally feed that back in, right? And that's where the recommendations will come for that, 2023, 2025 biennium is what did we learn by going through this process to feed back in for the next iteration, which the next iteration will include an updated and new quantitative wildfire risk assessment. So the data we're using today will be the sort of the conclusion of the use of the 2017 quantitative wildfire risk assessment. And typically that's about, the lifespan of these risk assessments as we typically think about it, 5 years or so. And maybe that'll become much more, I guess, done at a much more rapid pace, maybe every 2 years or so, but we're still working out those details in other efforts. So that's just to put us in context here. I'm just going to give you then the broad overview of the QRA, what it included, what it's saying, and then we'll look at those maps, the summary maps at the very end that bound us in this process. So, usually I like to start with this and just think about when we want to make an assessment of risk, we really need to capture these three components. All of you that work in fire recognize we always think in triangles for some reason, and here's just another case of doing so. And so we really need to assess these components to get to that risk and that risk profile. And we do this for many values typically. Sometimes you can go to a single value, but really in this case, we were up around 26 different values included in this effort, so that we encapsulated what the citizens of Oregon dominantly consider the values at risk from wildfire. And so you get probability, intensity, and susceptibility. And it does take, the top two components come from fire hazard modeling. And then the bottom, susceptibility, really is more of a collaborative process of trying to understand and incorporate how values respond to fire, and then get them on a level playing field so that they can be compared to each other, which is typically a challenge in the non-monetary environment. Dollars make things a little bit simpler to compare, although they make our lives complicated. So really the process that we work through is this quantitative risk assessment process. There's a GTR, so a General Technical Report, issued by the Forest Service in 2013 that really describes this process in earnest. And there's a companion 2010 that talked about highly valued resources and assets and how you get those onto a level playing field. So those are two resources that can be referenced in addition to the specific methodology reports that we have for the QRAs, either here in Region 6 or more broadly, the efforts in California or Utah or other parts of the United States. This image really encapsulates the process pretty well. And so I'm going to walk through each of these little components and how they link together. And then we'll look at some ugly math equations later, just to show you that it's not just all drawing pictures on slides. So we start up here in the upper corner and we look at these highly valued resources and assets. And really what this image is trying to tell us is that we need spatially explicit estimates of where these values are and in what condition they tend to be in when we're thinking about at least vegetation. And so, we are somewhat bound by available data on what values we can ingest, but we typically have pretty good data, especially here in Oregon and Washington, relative to other parts of the United States. And it's just because of our long history of engagement in the natural resource environment. And so we spatially map those, and we can gather those, and then we have those available so that we can make specific relationships or draw specific relationships between the assessment of fire hazard, i.e. the burn probability and fire intensity as it relates to each of these individual valued resources and assets, as well as them in a composite index that we can build them together. And really that bottom piece is trying to capture that fire hazard component to all this, which is getting to burn probability and fire intensity. And it lists multiple intensity levels. We typically capture that in flame length classes, if you will, which is what you see in the image above in the upper right in the response functions. And so when we're running these simulation models using the large fire simulator, which is the FSIM model that came out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, back in 2011, but is built off of a platform of equations that go back as far as the 70s, maybe even the 50s in some cases. So some of these really long-term, these equations that have been used over a very long period of time have been ingested into a simulation model that can ignite fires and grow fires based on historical weather streams. The QRA was built off of a 30-year history of weather streams in different climatic regions around Oregon and Washington. They call them FOAs, so fire occurrence areas. It's sort of irrelevant. That's just a little bit of climatic differences. And then you simulate, in this case, about 10,000 iterations of fire seasons, and you have spatially constrained ignitions based off of historical patterns, and then the growth of fires based off of the weather streams that are coming through. And you grow those fires each season for 10,000 seasons. And every time a portion of the landscape is intersected by a fire, you're essentially tallying that and dividing it by 10,000. That gives you the probability estimate of that location experiencing fire. And that's how we end up with a burn probability map across Oregon and Washington. And I'll show an image of that. All of that is calibrated to actual fire occurrences. And so you'll see that it's fairly reflective of the fire history that we've experienced in this region, because it's highly calibrated to that and to the weather streams that are coming through. The next iteration will have some adaptation and will constrain some of that historical weather stream, but that doesn't matter in this context. So once you have a distribution of the fire intensities that occur, an estimate of the fire, and of course the estimate of the burn probability, we can then turn to, all right, how susceptible are these values to the fire that we expect to occur at this location? And that's where it comes into this response function component. There's not always available science to address this question, and so this is really an expert-driven process where we look at a value and we say, all right, if it experiences, say, less than 2 foot flame length, do we receive positive benefits from that, a fuels reduction benefit, for example, or do we start to see negative consequences? And if we're seeing negative consequences, are they, minorly negative, just a little bit negative, or highly negative? And in the case of this example, we see positive benefits from a fire intensity level 2, which is typically less than 2 feet flame length. And as we scale up, eventually we start to see negative outcomes from that intensity of a fire. And so somewhere around 8 feet, 12 feet, 16 feet, we're starting to see increasingly negative consequences from a fire to that specific resource or asset, if you will, whether it's human communities, watersheds, wildlife habitat, infrastructure, or others that are not listed here. And you do that for each one of these. And in many cases, you do that for even subcategories of these broad categories to parse out, say, if you have a timber stand that's in an early seral stage, that's going to respond differently than an older forest stand to the same type of fire. And so you can parse those out in subcategories. And we'll look at a little bit of those here later in this presentation. And once you get through that process, then we all in a collaborative environment rate their relative importance to each other. And so often we start with, say, here's your human community, and it gets 100% rating. It's what we want to protect the most, humans and lives and their built infrastructure. And so maybe that gets 100%, and then we go to, say, wildlife habitat. Does it have equal relative importance at 100%, or is it 80%, 70%, so forth, on down to 10%? And you do this for all of those values again. And this is how you can get them all onto a similar scale so that they can be integrated together and comparable across each of these data sets. And that's just something, because we're not operating in a purely economic or monetary environment. It's a process that you have to do to be able to ingest things like vegetation condition that doesn't have a monetary value per se, or wildlife habitat, or water quantity and quality, et cetera. So they're a little bit challenging to get those dollar values from. So that's the overall process. And of course, we have this particular QRA here, and this, back in the Wildfire Council days, where much of this language comes from. This is the risk assessment that we were operating on in that environment, and that has now been translated into this. And so this is what we use to ultimately summarize those high risk categories that we're bound to, and I'll show an image of that later. Just so you know, this is what it looks like from burn probability perspective. On the left is the raw image across the region. On the right, the black polygons are the fire history up from 2001 to 2017, just to give you a sense of how the calibration process works and how it relates into actual fire occurrence. And you can see that it does a pretty good job of highlighting those areas where we experience many more large fires in both Oregon and Washington. This will invariably change with the next iteration of the QRA, particularly because the fire environment is changing so rapidly. And we're going to see, while on a relative sense, we may not see a lot of shift, we're going to see the actual probability numbers increase pretty significantly, which is reflective of the conditions that we've experienced. To give you a image of what that fire intensity component looks like, again, encapsulated within flame length classes that you can see here on the bottom. Now, this is a sort of weighted average. This is, all those simulations, all of the estimates of fire intensity when a fire did burn through a particular location of the landscape has some level of a probability of that occurrence, that flame length occurrence, and we can integrate those into a weighted average, in this case called the conditional flame length. This would be our best estimate, given that potential variability, of what the flame length would be when we have a fire on the landscape. And of course, it's not surprising to see the Western Oregon region, our forested, highly productive region, producing greater flame lengths than, say, the Great Basin and that sort. And so you can see how that plays out across much of this landscape. Again, driven by the fuel conditions, those weather streams and the weather conditions that are present at various locations across this landscape, and the topography that influences fire behavior as well. So these are the two conditions these are the two fire hazard components that came out of the quantitative wildfire risk assessment. That's what then we translate into that full risk assessment by determining the susceptibility of all those values that we placed across the landscape. And there were a lot. As I noted, there were I think 26 individual values integrated into this, many of those having subcategories that went through this similar process that probably rounded out to 50 or 60 different individual little layers that were considered by experts in building this ultimately this data set. When we have this, we have each of these as individual layers. We have their impacts as individual layers, their expected impacts from fire as individual layers, and we also have them in these composite indices that we'll look at in a little bit. And so you can see, infrastructure being an important value on landscapes, people and property, and these are the data sources that were used at the time. Some of these will carry over or be different in the next iteration. We assessed the timber resources in the state of Oregon and Washington, the overall vegetation condition. So looking at the several states that are present across much of our forested regions today relative to historical conditions, and this is sort of that resilient forest condition assessment. And then we looked at watershed health, wildlife habitat, particularly keying in on threatened and endangered species or species of concern, which you can see this list here that was considered in that QRA. So as I noted, so there's a big list of values that are present in here. Each of those required us to go through that response function process, and I just wanted to put another example in here for you all to see, and this is just looking at infrastructure. These sub-HVRAs are listed here. So under that infrastructure broad category, we were looking at all of these individual values on the landscape that go from power lines and into our travel infrastructure as well. And then the fire intensity levels. So 0 to 2 feet, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, 8 to 12, and 16 and or 12 and above in fire intensity level 6. I believe I got those right. And this is how these are anticipated to respond to said intensity level of fire. So these high voltage transmission lines, the big steel towers you see out there, if they experience a low intensity fire, they're supposed to be expecting some positive benefits, reducing the fuels, reducing regeneration of trees that end up falling into power lines, et cetera, are considered there with some neutral benefits. And as that fire intensity level increases, there's this increasing concern of loss, as reflected in this response function from positive, sort of a U shape, into negative. Different for low voltage in this case, which would be the wooden power poles that we have distributed through most of our communities. There's expected negative impacts even at the lowest intensity, because they are wood structures and are capable of igniting at that level. So I just bring these as examples, and of course these are the actual data that were used in the quantitative risk assessment that we're discussing at the moment, and these will be reviewed as we go into the next iteration that we're going to start. We're already starting, but we'll start on this values component next year. All right, and then these were the ugly equations I mentioned. Don't try to read this. Don't even try to. The point is that we integrate that variability in fire flame length or the fire intensity level with all of those values from the response function, as well as the relative importance of each of those values. And that's what you see here. The flame length probability with the response function, how it responds to that flame length with its relative importance. And you do that and you sum them all up and you can get to CNVC. So you do this for this top equation we do for each value, and then we take each of those values and we add them together as well. Again, this is all very spatially explicit, so they have to exist somewhere to influence the risk at that level or at that location. If they don't exist, they don't influence it. And you get to this, what we call CNVC, which is conditional net value change. So net value change is just that. What do we expect the change to be? That net value. In other words, is it going to be negative or positive or some blend of the two, depending on the values that are present at a particular location. And you'll hear the term conditional net value change. That's all it means, is the expected benefits or losses at a particular location, given that we've addressed all of these values and how they respond to variation in fire behavior. The second component, which is the component that's actually within that's mentioned in section 18 here, is that we use the top 4 classes of ENVC. Now, this is expected net value change. The only difference here is that we take the conditional net value change, conditional on fire occurrence, and we actually integrate the burn probability, so the likelihood that fire is going to occur there. And now it gets us into that expected positive or negative benefits, because now we're integrating burn probability. But it's just a simple multiplication of that burn probability map you saw by the conditional net value change, which is the summation, again, of all of the impacts to all 26 of those values that we quickly look through in that list. And this is at 180 meter pixel, downscaled then to 30 meters, but originally run at 180 meters for the quantitative wildfire risk assessment in 2017. And that's what we have. Now, those then can be, that data, that information can be summarized up into larger landscape scales. I'm going to show you some of the pixelated data, and then we'll look at some of those summaries. But before I do that, this is just when we step back and after we run all those equations and do all that math and we look at the whole region and we distribute our value system through this process, this is how it played out in the end, is that we have given of 100% of our value potential, 33% of it went to people and property. So the majority, it's got the largest slice of this pie. Infrastructure next, water and watersheds, then timber followed, wildlife habitat and vegetation condition. So as you work through each of those components, this is ultimately how the P&W QRA allocated our value structure broadly across the region. And this is what it looks like. So the left here, this map on the left here, this is that conditional net value change. Cooler colors assume some positive benefits out of fire is going to be the most likely outcome there. The warmer colors are indicating, and the increasingly warm colors are indicating increasing losses should a fire occur there. And then you can look across the region and see the distribution of where those values are and how fire would impact those. Now this is that conditional. So this does not integrate burn probability or the likelihood of fire, which is why, you know, if we were getting fire in the Coast Range, we would expect significant losses there, given the values that are present there, particularly the timber values, but in conjunction with the wildlife and the communities that reside out there. When we do fold in that burn probability and get to the expected net value change, that's where you see these areas with a lower probability of experiencing a fire starting to separate from the conditional net value change map. And you can see that occurring here in the Coast Range, since we're expecting the fires to remain relatively rare over the 5-year period of the lifespan of this quantitative risk assessment. You can see that the expected net value change declines pretty significantly relative to the conditional net value change. Doesn't change a lot of the rest of the state, but that's the big shift, is that you see a drop of that. And you know, both of these tools can be used in different environments to help inform decision making. We seem to be tasked with looking at this expected net value change, so the map on the right, as summarized in larger landscapes. In this case, we did summarize them into this map on the left. The map on the right is from Dana Skelly, and I'll talk about that shortly. But this is now using Huck 10 watersheds, the old Huck 5s, and it's just a summation of the ENVC values that we saw on the map before. So that expected net value change at smaller scales now summed up to an entire landscape, in this case, a watershed. And a Huck 10 watershed. And this is the map that the legislatures were keying in on from the Wildfire Council and saying that the top 4 classes, as you can see here in the darker orange into the deep red, are those landscapes that they want to target. In addition, they want to target areas that already are NEPA ready, this is a draft, as I should say, because Dana informed me that this is being updated. So there's going to be an improved map, but this was at the time from 2 years ago, the map that we were looking at least in the Mitigation Committee and the Wildfire Council, as NEPA ready, shelf stock, as it's listed here. So landscapes that have already gone through the NEPA process. And so at a course level, you can look at mashing these two together. The top 4 classes from this map, so the orange, the darker orange into the deep red, matched up with these NEPA ready projects, or the new NEPA ready landscapes and projects that are available, and that gives a high level course start to the strategic investment.
Hey Chris, can I just ask a quick question? Sorry to interrupt.
I'm done anyway. You didn't interrupt.
Awesome, perfect, great. I'm sure there will be many questions. Can you refresh for the group's knowledge what size these watersheds are, these Huck 10s? I know you guys go down to Huck 12s too. And then I know those maps change quite a bit once we look at the Huck 12, and it's like some of those areas that show up as like yellow and blue even, we start to see some areas popping. So like, how do we anticipate those four classes changing, and what's the appropriate level for us to be looking at for this group?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. So the first part of your question's easier than the latter part. What's the appropriate scale? I think I'll leave that portion to all of you to decide. But these Huck 10s are large. I think some of the smaller ones over here in the Coast Range are probably in the 20,000 acres, but they range up to 200,000 acres, I think, pretty readily. So these are very large areas in this particular map. I can pull up a Huck 12 that will downscale this pretty quickly to, I think, much more manageable landscape configurations than these broad Huck 10s. So they will downscale, and that does help because it will, a lot of risk, say down here in the Medford area, right, is driven by the incorporation of the community. And if you go to a Huck 12, you can separate the community from the landscape. And that's part of what you gain in that. There are other landscape configuration methods, whether, potential operational delineations and otherwise, that are more akin to Huck 12s, which I think are a better scale for addressing, a real comprehensive project. So it will break up some of these larger blocks that you see and help really inform the decision process, I think, if you went to a Huck 12. Assuming we can, I just know that this is the map that was presented to the council and the legislatures and what they are currently thinking of. Is that enough, Dylan?
Yeah, I think that's just we should throw one up there because it looks different. I think we're just going to have that conversation as a group, because some of these areas seem like they fall off, but then once you throw a Huck 12 on there, obviously a lot more is in play. Like our good friends in John Day that seem completely off limits. There's actually some good stuff around some of those communities and things like that.
Thanks, Chandra. I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted a clarifying question off of that, which is, can we do that? The bill language says we need to use this map. So can we refine it to a finer scale and use that in making our determinations? Because that seems like something we might want to do if we can.
That is not a question for me to answer. But here's the Huck 12, just so everybody knows that this is the difference that Dylan's talking about.
That's a good question, Chandra. I'm going to make a note of that. I think throughout this process, we'll see a little bit of the language that's actually written in the bill, and then probably come up with some other ideas that make sense. So yeah, let's talk about that.
Chris, are you trying to show a Huck 12 version of the ENVC?
Are you not seeing it?
Not yet.
Teams.
Thanks.
All right. Let me figure out how I can do that. It doesn't allow me to share screen. It shares specific files. So hold tight. There you go.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Jeff, of Chris?
Of course, sure. Thank you.
Chris, I guess I just was wondering from your perspective too, if you feel comfortable. I don't want to get you into answering a policy question per se, but to the degree that what's captured here in an ENVC map, reflects the likely outcome and burn probability of fire to any given, sort of the aggregation of the HVRAs for within that sub watershed, how well or not well do you think it captures where that risk is being transmitted from on the landscape? Meaning, like, to what degree are we not capturing the likelihood that wildfire gets transmitted from some area into the place where that HVRA occurs and has a positive or a negative outcome, and is there opportunity, and this is the piece you may not feel comfortable answering, but to what degree is this group able to consider that transmission of risk in addition to, say, this ENVC map when it's prioritizing projects at a landscape scale? Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, that fundamentally what you're talking about with the risk transmission is a completely separate analysis, which I've done on many occasions, and it can be done pretty easily for the state of Oregon. There are some coarser estimates already out there, but we can refine those. So, you know, if you're treating an entire landscape around a community at a HUC 12, you're going to capture not all of the risk transmission, but probably a large portion. But really what this map is doing is just summing those and their spatial location, not the source of that risk. So it sort of depends on, it's a little bit hard to say. That is a completely different analysis and a different way to look at this. This is really about their place, although that their place gets expanded a little bit because we're summarizing at a watershed. If I take an example I can think of, you know, if we're looking down here in the Ashland area, a lot of their source of the risk is towards the north and west of the actual community, because the wind directions come from that, and many of the fires are starting on the west of the community. And Chris Chambers, you can always interject if I'm capturing this wrong. And so when you do the source analysis, you can see that becomes these really critical locations to treat to prevent that potential. When I look down here, you would likely pull a HUC 12, say in the Ashland Creek watershed, and it would say you should treat within the watershed rather than where that source is. So it becomes it's a fundamentally different picture, and it may steer you away from really addressing the source. But it, you know, if you chose the other polygon over there to the west, then it would capture some of that source. They're just not a one-to-one relationship, and that probably is another layer of information that would be useful if we're going to drive towards community protection. That answer your question, Pete? Or did I just make it more confusing for everybody?
To answer my question, I have 3 more in its place now, but I'll stop talking.
Okay, let's circle back to you in a minute, Pete. And I see a couple of other hands. I do want to mention that there's some great notes that are going on over here in the chat. So be sure you open that and have an opportunity to kind of track along with that. But I think we can multitask. I don't very well, I know that, but I know others can. So I'm not sure. Amanda and Dana, I see hands up. Dana, you just happen to be closer to me on this computer.
I love Hollywood Squares. So it's like the story of our lives these days. So a couple of quick things. One, Andrew, I saw your offer for some of the layers from NRCS. One that would be really helpful is exotic plant layers. I think you guys have the best data for that of anybody. And one of the deficiencies when we did the first iteration of the QWRA was really representing rangeland values accurately. The best way I could think of to approach that would be with exotic plants, because that's what we spend a lot of money fixing after the fact. And even though that may be, I'm not sure how that fits in with the general scope of our priorities, considering, you know, Oregon's priorities. But if you're working on some layers, I think exotic layers and finding a way to incorporate that into the range discussion would be great. I know we're planning on doing that for the next iteration of the quantitative risk assessment. And I know when we did the Governor's Council, our folks, especially in Eastern Oregon, noticed those deficiencies and would love it addressed. So maybe there's an opportunity there. 2 other quick things, and this ties into what Dylan was saying about what is and isn't well represented in the QWRA. The Bull Run watershed, doesn't show up as a problem area. And a lot of that, I would think, and Chris, this is probably like a fun over beer modeler dorking out discussion, but I think that has a lot to do with using burn probability and a lack of climate change incorporated into the model. And what there's no model, for example, that would have shown us what happened last year, right? That was pretty amazing. But I think what we're all experiencing, watching the news and just in our lives, is that every year gets worse and more unimaginable things are in front of us every year. So the quantitative risk assessment has limitations, and all of our modeling has limitations because climate change is unprecedented in our lifetimes. But there are places that we know if we lose them, like the Bull Run watershed, we have no ability to really address the dramatic cost that will have, and not just in terms of dollars. So I think when we're being intellectually honest and curious through this process, this is an amazing tool to ground to. It speaks in a lot of levels. The Governor's Council spent a lot of time going back and forth on what we would use as our bedrock, and after hard discussions landed on this. I think it is the right thing, but I do think things will show up that aren't in there, and I think we want to find a way to add those to the process. And then the last piece is high frequency fire areas where most of the fire is a benefit still need maintenance and still need some work around those communities for hardening and to support them. The other benefits to making sure we incorporate them in our thought process are, if you have fuels treatments in the right places, then the teams are done with the fire sooner because they can burn out from prepped lines, and you have less smoke impacts to the neighboring communities because the fire's on the landscape for less time. And we have a lot of great success stories about that in the region. So again, totally on board. I think that the QWRA is absolutely 100% the right bedrock, but I do think we want to be open-minded about how we incorporate less obvious priorities into the discussion. And thanks for that. Thanks.
Great point. Amanda?
Yeah, Dana, that really led really well into what I wanted to comment on, which is this idea of that smoke inhalation. And I don't know that that was incorporated at all into the QWRA. And the health effects from smoke, recognizing that it's not just direct fire that affects communities, but also those health effects as well from smoke. And I see that Chris raised his hand too, but the other thing that I wanted to mention as well, that I'd be curious about what other people think related to that, and that idea of fire on the landscape for a shorter period of time, as far as the health effects and other things. Of course, fire is complex and good benefits too, but if there's the ability to spend any of this money on things like adequate ingress and egress for firefighting, and things like that, and road maintenance, things that would be service work but aren't specifically fuels manipulation. So just wondering about that, because I know that there's a huge backlog of that type of work on our public lands. So.
Yeah, another good point, Amanda. Thank you. And Chris, and then let's circle back to Pete. He had a couple of other ideas.
Yeah, Chris, so you've referred to it as the 2017 QRA. Has any of the data been updated since 2017 in this?
No, but it's in process.
Will we be the beneficiaries of a more updated map? Mostly thinking of just all the fire perimeters that have burned since 2017. That would really change the fuel profiles in here, which would then translate down the line to pretty significant changes in the CNVC.
Right. No. We can do the overlay and we can certainly show those, but say getting to a new burn probability map that incorporates those, that is not something that, it takes a year or so at this scale to get a new one done. And so it wouldn't, we need to account for those because, something like the bootleg or whatever has certainly changed that risk profile, either by losing the value because it's already burned, or by being unburnable for some period going into the future. And so we have to add that in as ancillary data at this point. but that will all be in the next iteration. Only we're not going to see that until, at least the fire hazard piece, the values piece will take a little longer, next June, probably at the earliest, to get that hazard assessment done. And then the full new PNW QRA probably by the end of the biennium, really, maybe a little sooner than that.
Okay, thanks. Pete, why don't you wrap us up with one or two of your points that you had earlier? I might see some other hands. Go ahead, Pete. We'll circle back to some other folks.
Yeah, I'm just enjoying the conversation here and benefiting from all of this. I think in my mind, I was just going back to the overall kind of statutory charge of this forest and rangeland sort of resilience and risk reduction projects. And admittedly, my head typically is in the forest, and I have less knowledge and expertise in the background of what we would do, what kind of work is necessary for achieving those resilience and risk reduction goals in rangelands. But just recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach around the state is not going to be appropriate. We need to be really thinking about that in it. Recognizing that, I think looking forward to a climate, to a world with more fire, not less in all likelihood. Thinking about how we're setting landscapes up so that some of these fires are doing the good work of maintaining landscapes in a more resilient condition, and doing some of the sort of ongoing fuels sort of maintenance work, particularly maybe in our more fire prone landscapes, I think is going to be really important to us, because both the pace of the challenge that we're facing and the scale and extent of those challenges are only increasing going forward. So keeping in mind that resilience goal for me, so that we're not just chasing our tails constantly into the future, is, I think, going to be important.
Yeah, and awesome comments. And really, I'm really enjoying this conversation as well. I just want to, of course, just remind everybody that this is finite funding and finite time period to work. So at some point, I know we'll have that conversation of where do we move, and quickly. Amanda had a comment that you all can read. Good comment, Amanda, there in the chat. And then Alex has had his hand up. So Alex, why don't you have a moment?
I just want to remind folks that the language in the bill is the 4 highest risk classes. And so there is flexibility. I think there's flexibility for this group to include areas that might be moderate risk, So I think that'll be kind of up to this group to decide how you want to incorporate those different risk layers, knowing that it's not only extreme risk. The bill clearly says 4 risk classes, so there is some latitude there to kind of draw those lines appropriately. And that's all I had there.
Great. I tell you what, let's do this. Since we've got 20 minutes left, we certainly have some more conversation around this. So let's table it for now. We'll chew on this a little bit, look at some of the data, and thank you, Chris, so much for your presentation and really engaging with us and getting the conversation moving. And let's circle back. We'll make a note for sure that when we get together first week or so of October, that we'll have a little bit more in depth about this and really drill down. Anybody that hasn't had an opportunity to make any comments, I certainly want to have some time at the end for folks that just haven't had a chance to speak up. Alex, why don't you give us a little bit more about an example of how we rolled out eBoard in an abbreviated way, and then the last 5 to 10 minutes, we'll go ahead and open it up and talk about next steps and how we can move forward.
I am muted here. Can you guys see the screen here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. All right. So this is hot off the press. Not many people have seen this, but it's our initial results from our eBoard work. And so just to remind folks of that timeline, it was pretty abbreviated. We had 5 million allocated towards projects, and gosh, within, it looks like 3 weeks, we had, submission deadline and some initial determinations made, which was really quick, and we definitely didn't get it 100% right, but we're going to get into some of the things that I think we were able to make progress on here. Agreements took us the better part of a month or two, and that was for 5. And so just keeping that timeline in mind there. And then again, last billable day there. So what we're about to look at is essentially 5 months of project implementation work, less than that really. And I'm not going to get into this, but I just wanted, Megan will put it up on she'll make sure it gets to you, but we had an initial project selection eligibility and criteria. And, the thing that we did was the 2 things I want you to get from this are that we prioritized implementation projects, and we loosely defined those. And we had loosely defined planning projects as well. And so we kind of separated those into 2 categories. And then we prioritized projects based on a tiered approach. And so these are the 5 tiers. If a project hit all 5 tiers, it generally scored pretty well. And if it was an implementation project that hit all 5 tiers, theoretically, that would be, the perfect application. So at your leisure, we'll make sure that you get that. But this is, this was the approach. And so you'll see a couple different boxes here. And someone was asking about, can we extend existing grants and agreements? And so that you'll see ODF pre-existing bar right here. And that's exactly what those were. Mostly federal grants, some NRCS work, Western States Fire Managers that we received proposals from districts and then had some funding there as well. We had over $18 million in requests in about a week-long open period. We had about 4.3 allocated to projects, and we expended close to 4 million on projects there. So in a short period of time, relatively good. This is what it looks like. ODF managed projects versus partner projects. One of the bill languages is affirmatively seek and enhance opportunities for collaboration. And one of the ways we tried to do that was by heavily engaging our partners in the restoration efforts. We did carve off some for equipment and e-board positions to help with that lift. But this was the general split of funding for e-board. Another piece of the 762 language details involving existing forest and range contracting entities. And so for ODF projects, this is the amount that we pass through here for each row. So for federal agency, we pass through nearly 50%. And then for other ODF projects, we pass close to 75% of that total funding onto contracting entities, mostly through landowners. So a landowner would get a rebate or a cost share, and they would choose their contracting entity to work with there locally. We did our best to leverage public and private partnerships. We had 14 new partner agreements, 5 of which were large enough that they had to go through the DOJ. And so that's something to keep in mind with large projects that necessitates us to go through the Department of Justice, which is a process. I think, our quickest one turned around in three weeks. And so just a heads up there, the larger projects, the longer timeline we'll need to get those contracts in place. And then we did, we captured about 1.8 million in leverage funds just from partners. And so there's some additional leverage funds that I'm going to get to in the next slide here. But 1.8 million leveraged out of 5, that's not too shabby there. You're charged with focusing on high risk areas. That's part of what 762 is aiming to do. A little bit of a shotgun approach, but the majority of our funding did go to Eastern Oregon area and Southern Oregon area. So you'll see Southern Oregon had 20 of the 35 projects, and close to 2/3 of the funding went to that Southern area, Klamath, Ashland, Southern Oregon, where you saw a lot of that red on the wildfire risk map. You see 3 different bars here again, just unfunded are the tall green ones, and then the funded implementation. So this is implementation acres. Originally, we had planned for 7,000, and we were able to report close to 10,000. You'll see that federal agency FFRP bar has a tall orange bar well above what we expected, and that's due to a leverage by the U.S. Forest Service. So the Wallowa-Whitman, I think we only provided 80,000, but the total project included over 200,000 from the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, and they were able to do prescribed burning on 4,000 acres there. So we're pretty happy that we've we were reporting more implementation acres than we planned. And implementation acres were, again, the priority treatment type. But we had a number of other value-added information here. So on the left, you'll see eBoard, you'll see 762 language. And on the right, you'll see the eBoard accomplishments associated with that language. So the first one, reduce hazardous fuels on public and private forests. We accomplished close to 10,000 acres of some type of fuel treatment or arrangement. It charges us to kind of include federal NEPA approved lands. We were able to support that planning process through the Federal Forest Restoration Program for nearly 1,300 acres. It asks us to design projects to involve the Oregon Conservation Corps, close to 4,000 hours for young adult training. Projects that involve, that evaluate various types of fuel treatment methods. One of the few planning projects that we were able to fund was a U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest region West Side Fire Effects and Recovery Study, which evaluates different types of management actions across the landscape. And with the Labor Day fires, they were able to go and get that data that they needed for post-fire effects. So, that was a scientific research funding that, we'll probably see the results there in 2 to 3 years once it goes through the peer review process. Projects that leverage the collective power of public-private partnerships. We had a really cool project where the Northwest Ute Corps helped the Santiam State Forest kind of do some triage on their impacted lands there. As you guys may know, the Santiam State Forest office was, consumed by that fire. And so Northwest Ute Corps kind of coming in and helping out was a way that, a private partnership was able to help further the public state forest hiking areas there. And then projects that provide watershed, protect watershed health and use innovative landscape scale solutions. One of the largest issues, but one issue that we're constantly trying to find innovative solutions for is what to do with all the material that you cut from hazardous fuel. And so in this project out in Deschutes County, they were able to repurpose about 1,300 trees from 100 acres for in-stream habitat. And so, we didn't get everything right, but I think we did have a decent start there. And, like I said, we will definitely we'll share that call for projects with you. It's pretty slim. I think it was a 2-page call for projects. And so our hope is that call for projects that you guys are going to be helping develop will be more robust and include kind of some more quantifiable project selection criteria, things like that. So anyways, questions on eBoard accomplishments or, the process that we've been able to use here last spring? I know I went through that fast, so apologies.
Hey, Alex, this is Andrew. I got a quick question for you, and it relates to, scaling this 3 times the size of eBoard. Did you run into contractor availability issues or workforce to get things completed?
Yes, and we actually, through conversations, that's part of why we didn't want to really prioritize specific landscapes. Had we drawn a smaller box around it and said we want 5 million to go here, I think we would have run into that. One way we were able to get around that was using existing ODF agreements. So, the landowners kind of had it upon themselves to call whoever to find work to do a lot of that work where contractors were engaged. I've heard from the state of California that at a certain point you do reach a contractor capacity limit. Mm-hmm. And they've been significantly increasing their wildfire risk reduction funding, and they have hit that capacity. And so that's that new issue that they're trying to absolve, is bring their contractor capacity up. But Jeff, I don't think we really had that significant an issue with this eBoard fund. But again, 5 million, with 20, it could be different.
And then Alex, if nobody minds, I'm still off mute, so I'll take the opportunity. I had one other tag-along question. Was there and I hate to call it this, but a minimum standards of treatment? So we know that if we call it an acre treated, it's actually an acre treated, that we're changing the fire dynamics, not, if we look at like a 6- treatment, yeah, you're still getting crown fire, right? We're still contributing to pretty significant fire behavior. And that's something that with this funding that I think we need to be really thoughtful of, is that if it's a treatment to a certain standard that we all feel comfortable meets the objective of the funder.
And that's a great question, Andrew. And we really had a very limited, minimum standard. And that minimum standard was some form of arrangement, treatment to density or arrangement of fuel. And so theoretically, those acres could be, just pruning, not pre-commercial pruning, thinning, and everything else that you might need to see. 4,000 acres of that was prescribed fires, so I feel relatively confident that a portion of those acres were, may have met a minimum standard, but that would be a great thing I wish we could have had that in that last go around.
Sorry, I did not mean at all to put you on the spot. That was not meant to be a question by any means, but something that I think the group should absolutely consider as we're setting out the criteria.
It's great. Chandra?
Good point, Andrew. Let's take one more from Chandra, and then if we could do a little bit of a wrap up, and if you don't mind, if we could go 5-10 minutes beyond, I'd really like to get some feedback from the group just on how we're doing and what the next steps may be and how we can make some improvements to facilitate upcoming meetings. Chandra, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I really just wanted to highlight what Andrew said about being able to show the effectiveness of the projects that we're going to be recommending. And, it's really unfortunate that the results of some of the studies funded by the e-board won't be available, for us to use. But I want to, that same criteria evaluating various types of fuel treatment methods is in, the charge for our group. And so if there are things that we can pull from to inform our decisions there, I think it would be really great because, while funding new research is great, and I know that the researchers appreciate that, I think we want to pull from existing research as much as we can to be the most effective. So just wanted to put a plug for that.
Yeah, good point, and thank you. And I think I'm getting a feeling from folks that maybe there's a little more conversation about some of this. Alex highlighted that process just as an example of how awesome ODF is and the awesome things we can do. But we made some mistakes too. I mean, we jammed that in real quick over a 5-month period, and we made it work the best that we could. I would anticipate that we as a group have a little bit more time and a little bit more experience levels and a little bit more capacity here to do things a little differently and improve. So that's the goal and objective with that. We can certainly circle back and have more of that conversation, but just for the last few minutes, I'd like to get a sense from folks. And if you haven't spoken up, please do. This is an opportunity for a little bit of a wrap up here, but I'd like to get to a point that we get a feeling from you all of how we've done in this first meeting. Does this process work? Is this a good platform where we can bat ideas back and forth? And then take some time to think about our future schedules and how we can go ahead and get these out there in the long run so that we don't have to, schedule every week or so. And Megan can help by email, and we'll send out a doodle poll and that kind of thing to get folks on board. So please go ahead. Hands, I see, Chandra, your hand is still up. Is that a leftover? Okay. Dylan, are you fixing your glasses?
No, I'm both. I can do some concluding remarks too. I mean, Jeff, I think you did a really nice job today. I really appreciate it. I know we had to do a little bit of a wonky overview to get everybody on the same page for this first one, but it was good. I think moving forward on this, just thinking from a process perspective, all of our organizations, and I think every individual in this room has worked together in some capacity in the creation of this legislation on other projects. It was one of my critiques, I think, with the Governor's Wildfire Councils. We spent too much getting to know you time and high level stuff. And it's we can really just cut to the chase and really hit it at a pretty technical level, I think, with this group here, and start batting around some specifics. So I just wouldn't be hesitant to dive deep into the weeds in our upcoming conversations with the team. People will flag levels of discomfort, questions, pushback, whatever. And I hope people are candid in doing that because I think we all have a good working relationship. I think looking forward to the next meeting, and this is work for the agency staff. Unfortunately, I can't help much on this, but as best as you all are able to furnish us with some of those updated layers, maps, existing agreements lists that we can start to pull from to narrow this down and refine it further, it's going to make our job so much easier. And then I think just on the conversations we were having here about demonstrating change in condition, and being able to, determine whether or not we have an impact, thinking about the timeline that we're working within, I think it's really just going to underscore that either through some direct agreements and targeted funding or specific criteria development, we're going to have to lean on existing partnerships and capacities and projects that have already been designed, well vetted, and developed, and have all of that monitoring protocol in place. If we can back this up, unfortunately, I'd love to open this up to 50 new organizations and partnerships and collaboratives across the state to compete for it. But I really think to do this well within a year and a half, we're going to have to lean on all those existing arrangements that are already in place so that we can make the case for future investments down the road. But just some things to think about. And I really appreciate all the agency staff doing the homework to put all of your existing projects and NEPA ready acres and layers and information in front of us so we can do the much easier work of selecting from that map and refining a potential list of target geographies.
You bet, Dylan. Thank you. We will make a great effort with the staff here to provide information on the webpage and encourage everyone to take the opportunity to email back and forth. We will track that and keep all of our comments and documentation together as a clearinghouse for everyone to rely on, and we can continue conversations as we move forward. I would encourage that. It's not that we need to sit and wait for the next meeting. Let's have those conversations and come to the next meeting, with some thoughts. So thank you, Dylan. Anyone else? Amanda, please go ahead.
Yeah, kind of to reiterate some of that, I'd be really curious to better understand where some of that work has already been done. I think in conversations with others from this group and folks that are associated with organizations on this group that are not here, I think there was a lot of things that we can pull from, whether that be Joint Chiefs, projects that have or have not been funded, CFLRP projects that have or have not been funded, and other things like that, where, we can really take advantage of previous work that already has had a lot of collaboration with it. So I would, again, similar to Dylan, I do not have all the data, but it'd be great if some of the folks that are engaged in that in the agencies could bring some of that we can really have robust conversations around. So I just make that comment. And then related to workforce, of course, representing AOL, we represent much of that workforce that does do this work. And so just to give you guys a heads up, I'm hoping at our annual convention in January to have a panel to talk about some of this type of work where logging outfits and other AOL members could diversify or pivot businesses to do more of this type of work as well. So because there's so much coming online related to kind of, hand crew work, prescribed fire, things like that, hopefully I'll be able to have Grayback come speak and some others that are using masticators and other types of equipment. So I'm really trying to work on the front end to ensure we have the capacity to do this across the state.
Yeah, great point. It's a really nice holistic look at how this stuff gets done in the long run. Thank you very much. We will be relying on some of you specifically for some expertise and some documentation. So don't be, surprised if Alex gives you a call and says, hey, where's that map that you were referencing? So we'll work together and provide more information for sure. But our staff here at ODF will help collect that and synthesize that the best we can and get it spread out to the group. I did want to mention that we'll come up with some of the existing projects that ODF has had some, we've been able to document. We will be asking some others for some very similar products to help inform. EJ, Dr. Davis, I'm seeing your hand up, please. Go ahead.
really respect and appreciate our federal partners on this call, Dana and Paul. And so I hope that this statement doesn't come out wrong, but something that really I think is crucial here is obviously unit capacity. And it's something that there isn't a map layer for, and that there's really evolving situations going on with staff turnover, personnel, budget modernization, all these kinds of things in our federal agencies. And it really has an impact on the scale at which we might be able to see accomplishments through this program. And so I guess I just want to call that out in that, you know, we can look at, even when we look at places on the map that have succeeded in obtaining collaborative grants, or that we think of as really high accomplishment places, those places still can struggle with having enough people in the agencies to support the work and implement the work. I don't know of a good layer for that. I don't know, Dana or Paul, if you want to speak to that in a future meeting, but we really have to find a way to consider that. Thank you.
Great point. And that reminds me, EJ, that, you know, there will be a really neat opportunity, I think, in the next couple of meetings to pull in someone like Kyle Sullivan with our Federal Forest Restoration Program to speak directly to some of the projects that are happening, get a little bit more Forest Service perspective, Dana, and then also talk to some of the other, you know, soil water conservation districts and, you know, non-government organizations out there that are facilitating some of this, you know, specifically what Sustainable Northwest has been able to do with Loma Katsi and some of that. Chris, I know you're really dialed in on some projects down in Ashland. So I think there's going to be an opportunity, and I can't think of all of them, and Alex may not, and Ryan may not. So I, again, just encourage, when you have those thoughts and you think something would be really useful, this is our group, and we're going to get through this together, and send an email to me, and we'll make it happen. We'll invite folks, and we'll broaden the conversation. So thank you for that. It is 5:04. Any final thoughts? Ryan, I see that you've jumped back on. If you had to jump out for a moment, if you have something, please go ahead, but let's go ahead and wrap it up.
Well, yeah, mainly I just was gonna turn my camera back on just so folks would know that I was listening. I really appreciate the conversation. I got a lot of great notes and perspective. I know that my introduction, I think, got a little choppy, but I'm learning a lot right now, obviously. And so this was tremendously helpful for me. Appreciate the input, and look forward to continuing to help where I can.
Thank you very much. One final word. You will be seeing an email from us, everyone on this, not just work group folks, but all attendees. Megan will get an email out to you with the summary of these talking points, bullet points. They'll be easy to read through. If you see any changes you want to make, please just get back to us and we'll update that document. But it's something that we can build off of into the next meeting. So we're not starting at square one, and we're really moving forward. The other thought that I'm having is there will be some other faces potentially at next meeting, and we'll build out an agenda with your approval. Really want to get your feedback. And then we'll also have an email that will have potential dates, and we'll get out into that. One thing that I failed to mention, sorry, I probably should. If you get in a jam and you cannot make a meeting, please let us know that you have an alternate, and we'll be able to facilitate that and get someone, you know, in the meeting that can take notes and report back to you. But for consistency's sake, let's try to keep it to this group as best we can and moving forward so that we can continue those conversations with each other. So I'll just, there's probably more comments and questions, but let's wrap it up, and you'll see a couple of emails from us in the next day or two. Thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.